Hi, William. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm trying to share the screen now. Does it work?
It worked. Whenever you want, you can start.
Okay, all right. Hi, can you hear me correctly?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, right, okay. So, my name is William Oche. I'm a PhD student at the University of Milan Bicocca in Milan, Italy. And I'm presenting the update of my research as of now. I'm halfway through my PhD research, so I wanted to, sorry I couldn't be there to present, but I still am able to do it over Skype. So my PhD is titled Fluid Values, a Pluralist Approach to Land Management in the Petrochemical Industry of Western Ghana. And basically, I look at okay. So I use the concept of recomparability of values by John O'Neill and Juan Martinez-Alier to analyze what I call land planning regimes. And these land planning regimes are agencies that are in charge of the ownership, the use of land, as well as its environmental protection.
William, sorry to interrupt you. Do you have something like a headphones to connect to your computer? Because the sound is meeting.
Really?
Yep.
Because, let me see. It does not connect. No. The headphone does not seem to connect properly. Can you hear me, or is still an echo?
I think that is more or less the same. Yeah, it's the same.
Okay, so it's still an echo?
Sorry?
Is there an echo?
Echo. It's an echo indeed.
Oh, okay. Because my headphone does not seem to connect to it properly. I don't know why.
Just let me ask you to the public, can you hear him and understand him what he's talking about? They're shaking their heads, so it's understandable. Please continue.
Oh, okay. Okay. I try to speak maybe slowly and clearly. Like I was saying, I use the concept of recomparability of values from Martinez-Alier and John O'Neill to analyze these institutions. Because my argument is that they embody the process of legitimizing the value of land through their discourses, through the policies set in place for them, and through their everyday practices, and relating to land in this region. And so then from the start, I look at the conceptual history of what has been deemed as value throughout the years, and I look at how land has been inserted into this process. And then I look at what has been the prescribed role of the state regarding land use in these kind of different conceptions of value. And so I look at from the physiocrats who looked at agricultural land as the measure of value, and they deemed the state, or in that sense the laissez-faire, whether it was kings or states or territories, territory kings, as an unproductive class, but who are still necessary for breaking up monopolies. And then he moved on to the classical economics, of course, with also different ranges from Adam Smith to David Ricardo to Karl Marx, who focused more on labor, while land was just a factor of production. And they were also, to different degrees, they saw the state as unproductive laborers. But for instance, especially for Marx, they saw the role of the state as a crisis manager, as someone who is able to, as an entity who was able to contain civil strife, and as an entity who was able to keep the social reproduction of the capitalism going. Adam Smith and Ricardo were a bit more, they were not big fans of the state in that sense. Then I moved to the neoclassical economists who saw value as a subjective kind of pinned down to individual tastes and preferences. And land, yes, as a factor of production in this sense that can be traded based on people's ability or willingness to pay. And they saw the state as still necessary but unproductive, and necessary in the sense of the legal framing that was needed for private property to be held up or upheld. They saw the state as being the one that would provide the conditions for that. And so as this was also going on, especially after the 70s, ecological economists also became more vocal by saying we have to look at various ways that we discuss value. So from the point of intrinsic value, which is kind of ecocentric, by saying well, nature can exist outside the valuation of human measurement tools and conceptions. And then it's slightly moved into the anthropocentric to say, well, we can have plural values, not just looking at nature value, but also ethics, culture of people that is embedded into lands, also looking at labor theory of value in terms of productivity of land, and these can exist side by side with each other. And in this sense, land becomes a part of this interdependent system. So if you have a land, it's not just about how much productive it can be as a land or how people's willingness to pay, but it's also interdependent between its subterranean aspects. So when the water in the land, the land surface, and also the air quality, for instance. So the land degradation became one aspect of looking at land as well through this conception. And they saw the state as really grappling to define the borders of what should be valued in terms of land. So complexity and uncertainty became some of the ways they talked about the state in terms of how they saw the value of land. And so my research problem basically was to say that these land planning institutions at some point have to set the boundaries of what should and should not be valued through their approval process. And by the approval process, I mean the uses they allow for specific land, the uses they allow for specific land uses. And so they act as agents who legitimize and articulate what should be valued in terms of land. And so using this case study, it's a case study of an extraction region, which is basically a region with ecological implications, production implications, labor implications, and also financial implications. So I use this case study as a test to see how the land value is being redefined through these boundary setting processes of the state. And so I define value here as the weighted outcome of aspects of a decision problem. So I don't define value just in the economic sense, but in a sense of decision making by the public sector in the sense. And so my case study is the southwestern region of Ghana. It is the onshore recipient of the offshore oil and gas industry. It has been in production since 2007, discovered in 2007, in production since 2010. It is a region of about 1 million people. And it is also, the land tenure system reflects that of Ghana, which is 80% of the land is owned in a semi-common ownership, so it's families, chiefs, and communities, and then 20% is owned by the state and individuals. And so yeah, this is some pictures of the case study area. And so then I looked at 3 questions basically, and basically the questions focus on opening up, closing down, and transformation. So by opening up, what I meant was that I wanted to see what are the various valuation languages of land that is expressed by various experts in this region. So I interviewed spatial planners, environmental NGOs, chiefs, journalists, livelihood NGOs focusing on community development in this region, to kind of have a whole spectrum of how land is conceived as valuable in this region. And then I focused on the second question to see the role of the planning regime, which has to legitimize some of these values and not others. So I looked at this role over the past 20 years, which is basically 10 years before oil production and 10 years after oil production, to kind of see this kind of the redefinition of land value over time. And then I looked at how the planning regime itself is being transformed over the past 20 years through its activities, because due to the new introduction of this oil and gas process. And so I looked at this. If you look at the second research question, I look at outcomes basically. And then right now, in the current stage of my research, I'm looking at the processes that led to these outcomes. So when I talked about policies, discourses, and practices, is basically to try to understand the processes through which these value legitimating outcomes were realized in the past 20 years. And so some of the preliminary results for the first research question, after interviewing so many actors in this region, I was able to understand how different gradients of valuing land have been expressed through these interviews. So the first one is basically, land as commodity, which is directly traded, which was expressed by individuals, families, chiefs, and corporate entities, so oil companies in this region. And it's basically, I want land, you have land to sell, we have to make the exchange. Now, the planning regime is in charge of ownership and use, so that ownership has to be supervised by them in terms of land transfer. The use has to be appropriate, as set out by the rules of the planning policies, strategic planning policies. So ownership and use, and also the environmental impact. So you cannot just develop whatever you want if it has environmental implications. And then the second one is basically a land as bank entity, and this is a national level process whereby lands are purchased from chiefs and communities by the national government in their justification. They want to reduce speculation of land in this region by directly trading land to the oil companies, and then also to reduce the price of land if possible, because then they can be able to directly trade with the oil companies and reduce speculation. And land as source of community equity is also, since 80% of the land is owned by various common institutions, whether it's the chiefs or communities, they use the land as a way to get employment in the oil production process. So they say, well, you want land as a company, we can sell you land, but every year 20% of your workforce has come from the community, or every year we need this amount of money as a kind of recurring compensation, and this has also been talked about a lot. And land as sequester of carbon is basically where farmers and owners of forests are being, there's the talk of the potential of growing forests as a way to offset carbon from the pollution from the oil production process. And this is a very controversial move, because carbon offsetting has seen a lot of a pushback from Latin America and so many places, and in Ghana this has also been discussed in the case study area. And then the last one is the land outside market notions, which is environmentally sensitive land, culturally sensitive land like graveyards and all these places that are seen as off limits to any form of valuation in the first four categories. So then, going to the second question, this was the first one, looking at opening up. These are the various spectrums of value I see from the actors. Now, what does the planning entity do with this? So then, my finding so far is that the planning entity has been really limited to operate only in the first type of trade, the type 1, whereby they are supposed to be in charge of the transaction, the use, and the environmental regulation of the simple commodity trading of land. And within this kind of limited role, they still have a lot of power, because through my interviews, the languages of efficient use of land and the aesthetics of land use became very powerful tools that they expressed a lot in their interviews. So like I said, I'm still analyzing the outcome and their processes, and I'm just showing you the outcomes right now. So just within the type 1, I looked at the outcomes over the past 20 years, and then I looked at the various use of land that has been approved by the planning regime. So if you look at the graphs over there, the blue part is basically if I apply for a permit, that's the blue part. If it's approved, that is the orange part. And so over the past 20 years, from 2007 going was when the oil was discovered, and then before 2007 there was no oil. So especially for heavy industry, of course, you can see the oil production process has introduced a lot of heavy industrial activities into the region. But for me, the most interesting thing so far has been the informal commercial activity. So the oil production process is highly technical, and it requires a lot of skilled employment. So it's very difficult for local people there to get employment into this. So since a lot of money is still being generated, but difficult to get employment, the informal economy is one of the ways that people are able to sell stuff to oil workers or companies and engage a lot in this economy that is growing there. But for the past few years, the informal economy is seen as and destroying the aesthetics of the cities in this region. So it is becoming more and more delegitimized. It's not being approved when they go through this planning regime processes. And so you can actually see the dip between the before and after oil discovery. And this has been the interesting finding for me so far. And then I looked at
William, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, all right. So the third part, I looked at how the planning regime is being influenced by these, processes that is happening in the region, and like I explained, some of them, some of their competencies are being kind of re-centralized to the national level. So the land banks I talked about is one example. Or there is also the creation of parallel institutions. So, for instance, there's the Ghana Free Zones Board, which is taking a lot of planning functions away from this planning regime. And there's a lot of also decentralization of this region into specific districts, and it has been argued that it's a decentralization of basically rent seeking. People want to get as much of the oil money in terms of industrial location as possible, and they try to fight for their own kind of sovereignty in terms of districts or sub-regional powers. And on the environmental level, especially with carbon emissions monitoring, there's no capacity for this planning regime to do it, because they don't really have the tools. They don't even have monitoring stations, especially in communities where the factories are located right close to people, to settlements. There is no environmental monitoring station. So you can see this kind of sideline and also the reduction of competences in this region. So all these kind of different stresses on land. So whether it's the land impact in terms of ownership, land decadence, with the industrial processes going on there, and the land use shifts. I try to look at what are the impacts on food, for instance, in terms of like a proxy of local livelihood systems there, or just the level of local livelihood change. So I looked at this also in the past 20 years, the prices of food. So 10 years before oil production, 10 years after oil discovery. And you can actually see the difference. So before oil discovery and after oil discovery, some of them, there's a cost of food that is being shown through these graphs. So it's also other food stuff that I can show through this process. So once again, I want to stress that this is the outcomes, and then I'm using the interviews and the content analysis to understand the processes. So I'm still in the process of interviewing agricultural development officers and livelihood empowerment NGOs to really understand whether it's not just a matter of population increase in price, but it's also some of the land use shifts, land decadence, land ownership shifts that is happening in the region that is also influencing things like food. So basically these foodstuffs are grown, they are indigenous to the land there. So they are not just food that is normally imported in a sense. So some of my concluding thoughts is that, especially when it comes to the boundary setting issues, it has really huge impacts for how we understand the material aspects of land right now. We really have to move beyond the conception as land just fetching rent for landowners, because there's huge environmental implications for a lot of areas. That goes beyond the production theory that we still understand. There's the whole process of extraction is really under theorized when it comes to urban studies. Maybe Neil Brenner is kind of going into that mode in the past few years, but he still needs a lot of work in that sense. And also the role of what has been termed the food fuel biofuel complex. A lot of the crops that people used to grow to just consume, so whether it's coconut or cassava, now you can convert them to fuel, and it's having strong implications for land areas that are very dependent on land for food, especially in this case study area. And so these are some of my preliminary thoughts just coming out from the research. Thank you.
So now it's the turn to our second speaker of the day. So Alberto, whenever you want.
boa tarde. Peço disculpas porque vou tentar falar portugués, mas vai ser unha especie de portugalego, mas acho que non vai haber problemas para me perceber. Vou tratar nesta comunicación de salientar as principais características dun proceso, dun fenómeno de privatización e rehabilitación da fachada costeira, fachada litoral da cidade da Coruña, que se encadra, se enmarca nun proceso de liberalización dos espazos portuarios, dos espazos industriais tradicionais portuarios da cidade, que van a ser, con moita probabilidade, vendidos mediante subasta pública a promotores inmobiliarios para o desenvolvimento de operación de carácter inmobiliaria que sería, con certeza, a máis grande da historia da cidade. Entón, a Coruña é unha cidade de tamaño medio, apenas un bocadiño máis de 240.000 persoas, que está así localizada no noroeste da Península Ibérica. En esencia é unha península. Bueno, en amarelo podemos ver realmente o centro histórico da cidade, e en ese color rosa un pouco as áreas portuarias que estarían implicadas neste proceso de privatización. Mas como vemos no gráfico é unha península, por lo tanto unha cidade eminentemente costeira que tivo sempre unha forte tradición portuaria e unha interación con o mar e con todo o imaginario marítimo pois moito forte. Como aconteceu noutras cidades na Europa, con outras cidades costeiras na Europa, o seu porto, localizado no centro da cidade, está a ser, ben sendo progresivamente desmantelado das súas funcións tradicionais, neste caso, debido á construción dun gran porto exterior nun municipio viciño, que tería xa un carácter metropolitano, regional, e que, polo tanto, habilitaría espazos portuarios no centro da cidade. A entidade que xestiona realmente todos os terrenos portuarios, que é a Autoridade Portuaria, claro, ao construir este gran porto exterior adquiriu unha débeda moito grande que precisa urgentemente de reducir. E, polo tanto, a súa idea, a súa proposta é privatizar esos terreos que van ficarle, ou están a ficarle liberados no centro da cidade. E entón, con esta proposta comeza un pouco que o relato. Entendemos que esa excusa de tratar de conseguir diñeiro non é máis que o habilita tamén a implementación de un certo modelo de cidade ideolóxico, político, que ten unha definición moito clara de aspectos como o que é o urbanismo, o que é o espazo público, o que é o común. Este modelo, que podemos denominar como oficial, modelo de cidade que podemos denominar como oficial, trata, polo tanto, de trocear o litoral coruñés, de partillarlo en blocos e, polo tanto, facer subasta pública e vendelos a promotores inmobiliarios. Fronte a este modelo, existiría un outro modelo que rease máis como unha cuestión máis visceral, non está tampouco moito planificado, que poderíamos denominar un modelo alternativo, que é o defendido polo actual goberno local, polo actual o Concello da Coruña, que trata de fortalecer os usos sociais de espazo público e cívicos deses terrenos e, sobre todo, blindar a titularidade pública dos terreos. O que sí que é pertinente dicer é que isto non é unha análise a posteriori, é dicir, un análise que o debate entre estes dos modelos que son completamente antagónicos está a darse a día de hoxe. Cada día estamos a enterarnos polos xornais de novos estrategias, novos movimentos axedrecísticos entre os dous blocos por impoñer o seu modelo. En calquer caso, do modelo oficial, que é un pouco o que estamos a analizar críticamente nesta comunicación, sí que é posible definir tres estallos que teñen un fío conductor moito claro e que no plano temporal son secuenciais, que imos ver agora máis polo miúdo, que sería primeiramente a transformación do que é o centro turístico, do que é o corazón turístico da cidade, mediante unhas obras que se denominan obras da Mariña. Unha segunda fase que sería realmente a actual, na que están a debater hoxe en día, que é a privatización duns terrenos onde está un complexo deportivo e un hotel 5 estrelas, e o gran pastel en termos especulativos que sería a urbanización dos portos interiores e o desenvolvimento dese grande emprendimento inmobiliario do que falaba, 5.700 residencias. Por lo tanto, comezando co primeiro acto, que sería pasado, porque esa é unha operación que se finalizou, estaría rehabilitado, que é o centro turístico, a través como se comentei, das coñecidas como Obras da Mariña. A Mariña é o corazón turístico da cidade por excelencia. É a postal turística, digamos. Como podemos ver nas fotos, nas dúas fotos na parte superior serían a Mariña como estaba antes, a Mariña antiga, e abaixo temos como ficou despois dese proceso de regeneración. O que se pode ver claramente que foi unha gran non sei como dicir en portugués, mas ficou como resultante unha gran planicie, 50.000 metros cuadrados, soterraron o tráfico rodado, fixeron un túnel, e a orientación moito clara é de fornecer un espazo orientado ao turismo, sobre todo o turismo de cruceiro, que é unha actividade que está a incrementarse de maneira exponencial nos últimos anos. Cando chegou o goberno local no 2015, que sempre foi moito crítico xunto con outras institucións sociais con este proxecto, apenas pudo suprimir as últimas fases do mesmo, e ali se sinalaban que este proxecto, primeiro, era un grande custe, estamos falando en torno dos 70 millóns de euros, daquela aínda en plena recesión na crise económica. Podese ver un pouco nas fotos, tamén nestes outros exemplos, hai unha perda de áreas verdes, unha perda de servicios como de estacionamento gratuito, que hai agora un parque subterráneo privado. É un proceso, sinalan que pode, con bastante probabilidade, consolidar fenómenos de gentrificación que xa son constatáveis no centro histórico. Por exemplo, o frontal que vemos nas fotos da dereita, todo ese frontal de fundo é a día de hoxe a milla de ouro da cidade. Ali moran desde Mancio Ortega até directivos de banco, políticos ou tamén outros grandes empresarios. Por lo tanto, sinalan que todo este proxecto ao final o que fai un pouco artificializar todo aínda máis, incrementar a presión turística, a actividade terciaria neste enclave. Actualmente a discusión pública basculou cara a este segundo acto, digamos, que sería a privatización dos terrenos de La Solana Hotel Finisterre, que están localizados prácticamente no mesmo enclave. Trátase de un complexo deportivo que está pegado a un hotel de 5 estrellas, o Hotel Finisterre, que os teñen ambas as dúas cosas, están baixo a mesma concesionaria. Foron dúas entidades que se construíron sobre un areal que podemos ver ainda nas fotos antigas, que o areal é a praia do Parrote, que era a praia natural da xente da cidade de Bella, unha praia que acabou sendo absorbida cando o complexo deportivo aumentou aló polo 1968, digamos que privatizou todo ese espazo que antes era público. Como digo, un pouco o marco territorial que a día de hoxe delimita o debate político entre estes dos modelos de cidade. Hai tres documentos chaves que compre ter en mente para entender todo o proceso de disputa ideolóxica en torno a estes dos modelos de cidade. Primeramente, un convenio asinado no 2004 que vai lastrar completamente, vai atar de manos ao actual goberno local a hora de negociar, porque nese convenio asinado en 2004 o daquela altura o goberno local comprometeuse a reurbanizar cualquiera que fose o proxecto urbanístico que saíra despois o proceso de subasta. Hai un segundo convenio que é a modificación do PSON, do Plan Xeral de Ordenación Municipal no 2013, onde tamén daquela o goberno da altura mudou a clasificación dos terrenos para patrimonio privado. Seguían sendo públicos, mas xa se comenzaba a intuir certa intención de privatizalos en algún momento. E finalmente o PEPRI, que é o documento que legisla todo o centro histórico, o Plano Especial de Protexao e Reforma do Interior da Cidade de Bella e Pescadería, aprobado en 2015, que permite unha maior constructibilidade no enclave. Entón, Entón, tendo estes tres documentos un pouco na cabeza, no 2016 a Autoridade Portuaria comunícase abertamente, de maneira pública, ao Concello ou á Cámara Municipal a súa intención de vender, de privatizar esos terrenos, os da Solana e o Hotel Finisterre. O goberno local, ante a negativa de conseguir esos terrenos de maneira por unha cesión gratuita, como aconteceu noutras cidades como Valencia, que o Porto foi cedido de maneira gratuita ao municipio, eles o que solicitan é dividir a parcela en dúas, unha parcela para a Solana, outra parcela para o Hotel Finisterre, e que se deixen algo de tempo para elaborar unha proposta económica pola parcela da Solana, que é a que lles interesa, a máis barata, que ten un prezo de saída de 1,4 millóns de euros, mentras que a parcela do hotel son 4,8. A Autoridade Portuaria dá unha moratoria de 6 meses e o goberno local confirma a súa proposta en outubro dese ano e en novembro é rexeitada por unha suposta falta de documentación. Ben, a partir de aquí, aí xa comeza un informaçoes e contrainformaçoes que é bastante difícil de resumir, mas en esencia o que acontece que se producen moito posiblemente reunións secretas entre a Autoridade Portuaria e a empresa concesionaria, a que ten a concesión actual do complexo deportivo e do hotel, e esta concesionaria realiza unha oferta de 10 millóns de euros, que parece moito dinheiro, mas tamén hai que ter en conta que durante moitos anos os seus beneficios netos foron de 1,5 millóns por ano polas dúas entidades e o seu canon municipal, é dicir, o que tiña que pagar o municipio era apenas 98.000 euros. Por lo tanto, durante moitos anos foi un negocio redondo para eles. Entón, a Autoridade Portuaria, ante esta oferta de 10 millóns de euros, trata de volver a activar esa subasta pública e di, literalmente, e iso que esta frase é bastante significativa, e penso un pouco recuperarla nas conclusións, que non aceptarla supondría un perjuicio para el interés general. Desde o goberno local se sinala que, evidentemente, ainda están no proceso de moratoria, que é unha deslealdade institucional, etcétera, que en ningún momento se les di que documentación é precisa para subsanar ese problema administrativo que tiveron nun comezo. Resulta tamén sorprendente que nestes 10 millóns de euros, nesta oferta que elabora a concesionaria, o único que aumenta é a proposta económica sobre a parcela que lle interesa ao municipio, que é a da La Solana, que pasa de 1,4 millóns a 5,8, mientras que a parcela do hotel sigue sendo a mesma que o precio inicial de subasta. En cualquier caso, as obras da Mariña e o complexo da La Solana Hotel Finisterre non son máis que a antesala do terceiro acto, que é o que se nos ven encima, que é a reurbanización dos portos interiores, que este se que é a auténtica guinda do pastel. Trátase, sobre todo, dos blocos de portos que están numerados. No primeiro e no segundo sería máis para usos comerciais, mentras que no terceiro, cuarto e quinto se intentaría facer unha operación de carácter máis residencial. Estamos falando de que no principio se estimou en torno ás 3.000 vivendas, mas a día de hoxe se pretende facer 5.300 vivendas, 5.700 vivendas, que é o máximo permitido pola lei. E, por tanto, sería un maior desenvolvemento urbanístico na historia da cidade. A noso parecer, isto presupón que va a haber problemas importantes, non só unha transformación morfolóxica da cidade, sino tamén problemas de densidade, unha cidade de SEO, Coruña, unha cidade con moita densidade demográfica, problemas de servicios públicos, problemas de acceso, etc. Por non falar de que se rompería o tecido urbano, estamos falando de 5.700 vivendas de alto standing, en bloques de altura de entre 6 e 10 pisos, que van posiblemente a frear o que é un pouco a liña do mar, esa paisaxe da mar, van ter posiblemente un carácter elitista e posiblemente siga a promover eses fenómenos de gentrificación que xa existen no resto do centro histórico. En cualquier caso, tampouco quixera facer un análisis demasiado catastrofista. Tamén é posible que no caso de facer unha regeneración, tal como propoñan arquitectos como Joan Busquets, que foi o que elaborou o Plan de Xeral de Ordenación Municipal, é posible regular usos mixtos do solo, é posible preservar elementos identitarios, elementos da memoria colectiva da cidade, zonas verdes, espazos públicos, etc. Hai outro xeito de facer as coisas. Xa para ir terminando, a modo de conclusión, confirmar que existen, por tanto, dois modelos de cidade oficial que defende a especulación inmobiliaria a través de estrategias de privatización para cubrir esos custos, esa débeda que ten adquirida para a construción do porto exterior, e o modelo alternativo que é o que visa proteger a súa propiedade pública e promover os usos sociais e colectivos. Dentro do modelo o modelo oficial, a cidade da Coruña encaixa ben coa esa metáfora clásica da máquina de crecemento. Logan e Moloch, alá polos 80, preguntaban para que o crecemento, é dicir, qual é a intensa última do crecemento. Entender por crecemento produzado espazo e relacións sociais aparelladas o mesmo. Existe unha ideoloxía do crecemento baseada na reprodução do espacio que se asimila, de xeito colectivo, temos asimilado a unha especie de benestar colectivo, a que eso é o progreso, esa senda lineal do progreso. Mas eles xa alertaban daquela na altura que o que poden mascarar realmente son a procura de intereses particulares baixo ese discurso xeral do beneficio colectivo. Eles falaban de que existen alianzas, as élites económicas locais construen alianzas efímeras, temporais, que visan conseguir objetivos estratégicos en pugna, digamos, en confronto con outras élites de outros territorios. Rescato aquí esta frase que decía antes a autoridade portuaria, que non aceptar a oferta da empresa concesionaria de 10 millóns de euros iría contra os intereses xerais, porque acho que encaixa moito ben con esta metáfora da máquina de crecemento, porque realmente non é o beneficio xeral o que se procura, senón o interese particular, que é conseguir rapidamente liquidez económica para sufragar esa débeda que ten adquirida co porto exterior. Simplemente para rematar, porque acho que estou sen tempo, decir que estos dos modelos de cidade, o alternativo oficial, que está máis que explicado, e o alternativo, que aparte de buscar a regeneración do espazo en clave social, tamén intenta incorporar mecanismos de participación ciudadana. Incluso se está a falar moito agora de facer un referéndum a respecto de que a xente decida o que quer facer con eses terrenos. Está nun punto álxido nesta dialéctica e non parece que no curto prazo vaya a chegar ningún consenso. Fai uns días o Goberno Municipal realizaba un foro, o Foro Tecendo Litoral, no que se falaba precisamente de incorporar mecanismos de participación ciudadana e de como regenerar en clave cívica e clave de espacio social estes terrenos, e casi os mesmos días a autoridade portuaria, xunto co Portos de Estado, etcétera, toda esta élite económica que está a favor deste modelo oficial, preservaban o espírito dese convenio 2004 polo cal o Concello ten a obriga de reurbanizar como for o proxecto resultante despois da subasta. Finalizo simplemente dicindo que cualquiera dos modelos que finalmente se desenvolva vai ter con certeza que aglutinar coisas do modelo contrario. Simplemente, moito obrigado.
So basically we have 15 minutes for questions or comments. Do we have any comment, any question?
Luís Mendes from IGOT. I have two questions for both of the presenters. William, are you with us? Still?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so the first one is for you. Thank you so much for both of the presentations. They are very good. The first question is for you. How do you see, I didn't heard you speak about the concept of accumulation by dispossession. I don't know if you heard it before from David Harvey.
Yeah.
I think it would apply to your case study. How do you think it would be applied, or if you are thinking of applying the concept in your framework? For Barcon, so many questions for you, but I will centralize both in two. In every case study that we have seen here in the conference presented, there's always, for me, there are some concepts that are completely transversal to all the communications here. privatization, commodification, financialization also, touristification, gentrification, some concepts that are very important. The thing is, I haven't seen yet how can, your presentation was very good, let me say. My suggestion is, if you can tell me more about the regional law or the national one, because in Spain we know that there are some differences in terms of administration level, right, comparing to Portugal. How is there any kind of national law or regional one that has influenced that kind of neoliberalization of the public or private space, of the urban space? Is there any kind of law that you know, market the change between the two models that you are explaining about? And the second question is, how do social movements are reacting to all of this urban change that we are seeing now in Coruña? And are they participate, is there, because you mentioned in your conclusion, very interesting, the fact that there's some kind of partnership, citizenship participation that is being implemented, or you know, being paying attention by the politicians maybe, but only with the reason to co-opt or to try to, you know, get the popular feeling of the population to co-opt and legitimize some kind of intervention by the politicians. We know that here in Portugal, several experiences of participation, social participation, have shown that. They are very critical in the beginning, but then they are completely co-opted. I don't know if I can say this in English. I don't know if the concept is this, but they are like changed by the official discourse. So the thing is, how do social movements are reacting to all of this urban change? And if you see in this citizenship participation any kind of you know, possibility of change of what is going on?
All right. So should I go first?
We are collecting a few questions more, and then we have all the answers together.
All right.
Hello. Thank you both. Thank you for both your presentations. And I would like to ask you a question, William, regarding your methodological approach, because you mentioned in the title a relational case study research, and I would like to understand how do you precisely approach relationality, and what is the importance of it within your research? That would be for William and for Alberto. Alberto, right? I'd like to know like 2 or 3 things regarding participation. If you, when you mention participation, should I speak in English or Spanish or Portuguese, or I don't know? I'm lost right now. What?
English is better.
Okay. So, do you think first that participation for now is reduced to consultation or not? Is participation, I mean, when you talk about referendum, what is the regional scope of this referendum? Is it the city? Is it the region? So, because this means that the city is being thought at different scales, right? And the last question is, why do you think precisely, and I would take our colleague's comment, why do you think it would be important to merge the 2 approaches to the city, I mean the official and the alternative? Why? Because you mentioned in your comments, there's a last sentence that says something about merging, like, see? No, como...
Exactly.
And why do you propose that, the merging precisely? Because this is a certain political positioning from you, and I would like for you to make it explicit if possible. Thank you.
Any more questions? So let's the answers begin.
Okay. So from the point of the accumulation by dispossession, yeah, I actually started off looking at have this notion of the accumulation by dispossession going off of the original accumulation literature by Marx. But I actually found I found it quite limiting in what I wanted to do, because as I went to the field, I also kind of saw different circles of power that I didn't really know how to merge with the accumulation by dispossession literature. So, for instance, the forms of elite capture that I saw on the field really stretches from various scales and various levels. And I looked, so when you link this to, for instance, the land grab literature, they start off from the point of view of accumulation by dispossession, kind of pitting together land speculators and land fund managers as against local populations and, who are very passive and kind of, so this power relation is kind of clear. But on the field, like I saw this different levels of let's say, accumulation by dispossession, if I could call it that way, different levels of elite capture. So from chiefs to national level actors to international oil companies in this case. And so for me, it linked more with, there's a lot of kind of reactionary research also looking at what is the new emerging forms of land grab beyond accumulation by dispossession. So Lars Bohr in University of Roskilde in Denmark and Pedersen, they've written a lot about some of these things. And I think this is what I saw, that just this whole spectrum of who are the actors, it really expands beyond just the firm kind of community relation. And this is why I didn't really focus that much on the accumulation by dispossession, because I was seeing different levels of elite capture from the very local to the very international level. And with respect to relationality, yeah, you're right. So my original focus was on a relational approach between areas that produce and areas that consume. And I had to change my approach throughout my research, because I actually started from the point of view of ecologically unequal exchange, which is very relational, looking at areas that extract resources versus areas that consume them. But then I had to focus more on areas that produce and also extract resources. So production and extraction go in the same sense. So my approach to relationality focuses more on these actors at that level and not at the consumption level. So I'm looking at just the source area as an area where resources are produced and extracted, but not relating it with areas that consume them. And this is for very practical research reasons, that it was quite, oil is a resource that is highly liquid and very it's difficult to track who else purchases the oil and in what sense they use them. And so it was very difficult for me to get my second case study as the consumption area. Now, Ghana's oil is consumed in large quantities by China, because there was some loan agreements to build factories, and this was part of the deal. But then for me to relate this to a case study in China, I would have had to select a case study area that these resources were going there. Oil as a very liquid resource is kind of hard to track it down specifically, and to make my research quite simplified in a sense, I kind of dialed down on looking at the relation between production and consumption regions, and I focused on the production that produces but also extract. So looking at that region as a built-up environment and a worn-down environment at the same time. So I analyzed the relation between actors within that particular context. Yeah.
Thank you, William.
Okay.
Bueno, posso responder en portugués? Sí? O inglés ainda peor que o meu portugués. Então, con respecto aos movimentos sociais, a como reasir o tecido asociativo na cidade, é bastante curioso, porque realmente foi unha contestación moito feble, moito fría. E é curioso porque apenas uns meses antes do proceso destas obras da Mariña, acho que uns meses, un ano como máximo, houbera graves problemas na cidade de Burgos, co Gamonal, que houve un proxecto de regeneración dunha avenida, dunha grande avenida, un proxecto de 8 millóns de euros, tampouco era ninguna locura, e houve unha contestación social moito forte que tivo o apoio da maioría da xente, chegou a ser unha noticia que abrían os xornais a nivel estatal, a xente opinaba, a xente maioritariamente parecía que estaba en contra deste proxecto e que apoiaba a veciñanza, e en base a manifestacións, a todos os días estar lá a desmontar un pouco manualmente as obras, conseguiron frear ese proxecto. E uns meses máis tarde aparece este proxecto de Obras da Mariña de 80 millóns de euros, coa mesma lógica, nunha época de crise económica, vamos a facer un lavado estético do que é o centro, e non houve prácticamente contestación social. Houve unha plataforma que era paremos non as obras da Mariña, máis que a metade do camiño realmente disolveuse porque non conseguiron involucrar a cidadanía. Entón, nese sentido, a contestación social foi moito escasa. Foi aínda máis forte unha vez xa terminado o proxecto. Houve como unha especie de repunte desa contestación, mas realmente non é moito significativa. A primeira pregunta, xo que era con respecto da lei. Sim, perfeitamente. Sim.
Portanto, há alguma lei nacional ou regional, para além dos planos locais que tu muito bem, eloquentemente apresentaste, que explica uma viragem que possa ter havido do ponto de vista neoliberal de produzir o espaço urbano? Entendes o que digo?
Sim. Mas acho que não houve tanto unha deriva como unha progresão. Durante moitos anos a cidade, acho que 20 e poucos anos, estivo na alcaldía unha persona que non era do mesmo partido, mas era moito próxima á dereita, e a día de hoxe a Autoridade Portuaria, Portos del Estado, Ministerio de Fomento, prácticamente todas as institucións son do mesmo partido político que o partido neoliberal, o Partido Popular de dereita. Entón teña a mesma lógica, a mesma percepción, o mesmo modelo de cidade. A única ovella negra que saí é precisamente o goberno actual, que é o que trata de virar a situación. Entón, acho que non existe unha lei tal cual, porque o terreno portuario ten unha lei específica que pertence a estatal, é dicir, está xestionada por a Autoridade Portuaria, porque é unha ente administrativa que simplemente xestiona, a titularidade é pública, mas pertence ao Estado Central. Entón, nese sentido, desde o Estado Central até a última instancia, retirando o goberno municipal, pertence á mesma cor política, entón non é unha lei precisa, mas existe unha sintonía evidente no que se quer facer na cidade, nas lógicas da cidade. Con respecto un pouco polos dous, aos métodos de participación, eu, na miña opinión, acho que son máis un discurso político que realmente non hai unha reivindicación por parte da cidadanía de queremos un referéndum a respecto do que facer cos terrenos do Porto. Isto é unha idea máis política que sai do goberno local actual, que en ningún momento, con especie de globo sonda que lanzan, que en ningún momento definen nin o ámbito que supone que sea un ámbito municipal, entendo, mas en ningún momento se meten polo miúdo un pouco a analizar como pretenden que se ese referéndum, como pretenden que se esos canais de participación, até que punto a cidadanía vai poder decidir. É máis simplemente un discurso moi cool, pero máis que acho que vai ser pouco realizable. Esa, finalmente, por que propoño esa unión acho que a única... Eu teño unha visión moito pesimista, eu acho que vai impoñerse finalmente unha venda dos terrenos na privatización, e a única esperanza que teño é que ese desenvolvimento urbano que se faga neses terrenos se faga un pouco en sintonía cos preliminares do Plan Xeral de Ordenación Municipal do arquitecto Joan Busquets, que falaba de facer usos mixtos, regulados, etcétera, etcétera. É dicir, o único que a minha esperanza é que vai un pouco por esa liña, mas eu dou por inevitável que aí vanse construir hotéis, porque xa están os permisos prácticamente concedidos, un centro comercial, vai haber unha planificación dun circuito de consumo, se vai seguir apostando polo turismo de cruceiro, en ningún momento se vai a falar do lado perverso que ten de que sempre se este a crecer o número de cruceiros que chegan á cidade, e aquí en cidades como Lisboa esa forma parte da senda política, da senda social, dos problemas que e outras cidades, por suposto, en Marsella, en Venecia, en Barcelona. Mas acho que a única solución vai vir por unha especie de cesión por ambas as dúas bandas. Por a banda do lado oficial, acho que a cesión máis importante sería de habilitar canais de participación cidadana, pero reais. Tampouco temos esperanza a este punto, a esta altura do problema, non sei que canais se poden xa implementar unha vez xa iniciado o proceso. Non sei se responde moito ben as cuestións aquí colocadas.
So with this, we close the session. We invite you to assist to the next one. It will take in a few minutes. So thank you very much.